You know, he's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
I was a hair's way away from actually putting Little Big in the center of my senior thesis,
Mhm.
and my original plan was to write about like the bifurcation of genre and trying to talk about like trying to like think of a kind of literature that would almost bring things back to like Shakespeare or something, where you know like fantasy elements are like interwoven into like tragedy and romance, and like the world of fantasy isn't this like completely like kind of like segregated world. And like now we live in this weird moment where I mean, I guess this has been happening for a few decades, but like literary kind of quote unquote literary authors do these little experiments where they like write their little fantasy novel or
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
Like they write their little sci-fi novel, but then
Yeah.
like we'll be like, no, this is literature. This isn't fantasy. This is literature.
Yeah.
Um,
I call them genre tourists, you know, like
yeah, yeah,
because in most cases, very, very rarely do they understand, like they don't really understand the genre, what they're getting into, basically. And
yeah,
they don't realize that they're just reinventing the wheel. It's just like like there are people who have done this before you, like 50 years before you even thought of
yeah,
this, you know.
yeah, exactly.
Um, but
Well,
yeah,
and they
and
also it just shows a lack of respect.
yes, yeah, yeah, and that's why they're
It's like,
tourists.
bitch, who the fuck are you? I've never even read any of those books, to be honest. They always just turned me off, so they might be good. Like I never read like The Buried Giant, but it seemed by Ishiguro, but it seemed like
Hmm.
kind of interesting. But honestly, just the like I don't know, just like all the buzz around it kind of pissed me off for some reason, and I never got around to it.
Yeah, and there's also that like you know, as a fan of genre fiction, you can't help but feel like a bit miffed when when people are like, I'm gonna slum it in this genre, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
anyway, welcome back to the Getting Lit podcast. We have journeyed out of the final work of Italo Calvino, the famous Italian fantasist, and now we're moving on to an American fantasist by the name of John Crowley. And so for this episode, well, for we're going to do a series of episodes on John Crowley's book, Little Big. So I'm going to do six of them, and we're going to do each part every month. So what I want to encourage here is a sort of, I like to call it like a slow read. So we can really kind of go at a really kind of leisurely pace through this very big book. And you guys can read along as well. And joining me, who he's committed to every six episodes, so he's committed to 6 months of this, is former guest John. You might know him as Telepathy Party. That was
Yeah.
his call sign when he came on last time, like probably almost 3 years ago now. We talked about
Yeah.
John Crowley then. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure, and I mean, it feels like kind of the culmination of a long podcast history because
That's true.
I think I've tried to like sprinkle in John Crowley somehow into like most of the podcasts that I've been in
Hmm.
because I really want people to like read him. He's such a kind of like he's been kind of marginalized in this weird way because he doesn't satisfy really any moment or any movement. So yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here to finally talk about this book. Because yeah, this has been this has been stewing in my mind for a long time.
It's funny. It's funny actually. I don't think I got this on recording, but the last episode I did with Yerk from do you know
Mhm,
Yerk from Twitter? Oh, obviously
mhm.
you do. Um, I was saying that we're gonna do John Crowley, and he was like, oh, you should get John on for that. I'm like, I am. So like your reputation for like being a Crowley stan kind of
Evangelist,
procedure.
yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm drawn to John Crowley because partly because of how marginalized he is. It kind of gives you someone to fight for, but it sort of goes beyond that because he's been like the genuinely he's like my comfort writer when I like lose when I just like stop reading when I like lose my ability to read, I like always go back to John Crowley. And he kind of brings that back to me every single time. And he's a fascinating figure in the sense that he doesn't really have any like public MO, you know? Like there's like that's funny because like before we started recording, we were talking about kind of like who the author is,
yeah.
you know, and like we were talking about kind of like the death of the author. And John Crowley has talked about how he his career is unique in the sense that like you if you were to read all of his books individually without the John Crowley name on it, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on the fact that they're all by the same writer.
Hmm.
Um, there are like stylistic um similarities between some of them, like especially some of his some kind of you know there are little literary ticks that you can pick up on if you know him well enough. And there is definitely kind of like a Crowley-esque sentence, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and but yeah, he's for the homies. You know, I
Yeah.
think like he really is for the homies, and like any writer that I come across who has found John Crowley and like celebrates him, usually I'm in good hands with them.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that unites all of his stuff, and I must admit to not like I probably haven't read everything of his.
I
I
haven't
do
either.
I do want to go back to the early stuff. The early stuff sounds really
Mm,
good. Engine Summer sounds amazing.
that
Have
one
you
is
read that
good.
one? Yeah.
Yeah, so I've read The Deep, Beasts, Engine Summer, Little Big, um, The Translator, um, his Chemical Wedding translation
Oh yeah.
thing, which is super short. A bunch of his short stories like Great Work of Time, and In Blue, which we covered last time, and then the first book of the Egypt cycle. But I don't know why, but I just like haven't finished the Egypt cycle, and part of it is almost like I don't want to run out of things to read from
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
Um,
Apparently, I think it's his latest book, or at least a later book, is about crows. Like,
oh yeah, I never read that one either.
it's literally about crows.
Ka,
Like, yeah,
yeah,
car. Um,
yeah,
yeah. Uh, so yeah, he's very eccentric, and but what I was gonna say is that I think a thing that unites a lot of his stuff. I've read this, and I've read his short stories, basically. And a lot of his like nonfiction essay stuff or interviews and things like that.
hmm
And I think the thing that unites all of this is that I find that his personality is pretty strong in his writing, but it's not about the voice in the writing itself. It's more about a mood. Like there's there's a strange mood to all of his stuff that it's like this a kind of diaphanous, like fairy-like, for instance, to which is relevant to this book, quality to it, but nevertheless quite grounded. And a lot of people, and this is why a lot of people with this book in particularly try to classify it as magical realism, as if it's like a yeah no, as if it's like a kind of a as tortillas sort of thing, and it's really not
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. Like
It's
it's
not like
sort of
that at all.
um that's just
I
I
think,
feel like
yeah,
magical realism for books like this always seems like a bit of a cope to me. Like it's just like no,
totally.
you just don't want to admit to yourself that you're just reading fantasy.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's well, I think that like the biggest difference between magical realism and this is that, at least in my experience, and to be honest, the only like quote unquote magical realists that I've read are like a bunch of like brown and Latino writers.
Yeah, South American.
Including Gabriel, right. And in most magical realist books, like the quote unquote magical parts are kind of like stylistic intrusion on the narrative, where this kind of like exacerbated poetic kind of reality just kind of intrudes on the plot. And that often comes off as a kind of obfuscation from the problem the writer is actually trying to deal with, and a kind of shortcut is, I think, why those books leave, don't necessarily, I think, maybe they haven't aged well.
Yeah,
but I haven't read Gabriel Garcia Marquez in probably a decade, so I don't want to, and I trust that he's a really brilliant writer for a lot of people, but at least my experience with him is just that it feels like it's like this little dance that they do when they're like giving up or something.
Flamenco.
Yeah.
No, it's sort of like a I think in those books, and there's a whole it's not just Marquez, there's a whole heap of there's a whole tradition of this. Like the magical realist sort of thing is it's almost like an extended and very, I think, tangential metaphor that just keeps going on and on and on. And it's not, but the kind of magic in this, such that it is in Little Big, is like it's fully integrated into what the story is about. So it's not, and it is a magical book in the experience of reading it too. So there's those multiple levels there that he's really good at layering with his writing. So for this first episode, what we'll be covering is the first kind of book of Little Big, which is called Edgewood. And Edgewood is the name of the house that one of the main characters kind of is going to, because he's fallen in love with a woman who lives there. His name is Smokey Barnable, and he kind of makes his way to this house to marry Daily Alice Drinkwater, which is her family home. So the opening of this is so good. And I was reading it again, and it's like, this is just so cozy. Like the way that he has to navigate, he has to go on foot to the house, which is outside of the city.
Navigating Indian named places.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing as well in this that I must have forgotten or something. John Crowley loves a motif. He will often repeat certain things. And one of the things that's repeated a couple of times in this section is, and it's just so this is how this is also quintessentially American, because he's like, the cities that begin with I. Exactly.
All the states that begin with I.
Yeah, exactly what he's talking about.
When I first read that years ago, I literally remember sitting back in my chair and being like, wow, all of those states do begin with I. What's going on? And nobody has any sense of what happens there. Nobody knows.
Yeah, those are all the states that, coastal elites or whatever often disparagingly kind of call the flyover states, right? And that's that same kind of vibe there that often.
And John Crowley is a flyover writer in some ways.
And so basically the first book, not much actually happens in the first book in Edgewood. It's just basically Smokey, who has met this stunning, enormous woman. I kept thinking about, have you seen Deuce Bigelow?
Deuce Bigelow?
Yeah. It's a Rob Schneider film. No, it's a Rob Schneider
Okay.
film from years ago where he's becomes a gigolo. But anyway, he becomes a gigolo, but he gets all the off-cut women who the other gigolos don't want because they're freakish in some way. And there's one that he gets which is really tall, and every time she walks on screen, there's some black guy in the background going, "That's a huge bitch!" And so every time Daily Alice walks in the narrative, I'm like, I just
Yeah.
can't help myself. I just think that's a huge bitch. So she's tall, all right? Like,
Yeah.
so
She's like freakishly tall.
she's freakishly tall, and like
Or
again,
yeah, I think in the book it describes her as a little bit under 6 foot.
hmm,
But it's interesting because like my memory, I haven't read this in full since 2016. I've listened to the audiobook twice since then, but for some reason in my memory, she was like 7 feet tall.
yeah, that's what I got as well.
Um,
But like,
yeah,
but it does say that she's just under six. I think it literally says that at one point. But then she's also referred to, I don't know if it's Smokey's internal monologue or someone else's, as like a giantess. And I'm like,
yeah,
that isn't actually a huge bitch.
this isn't
That's not
that
it.
tall.
That's not that tall. That's like Gina Davis or something like that,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's not, um, so yeah.
This book definitely, John Crowley, I'm sure himself probably like, it's probably like a small man too. Like Smokey Barnable, you get the sense of him, and he's just the word that's attached to him at the very beginning of the narrative is anonymous.
Hmm.
Um, and you just know that guy. You know that guy who sort of falls away from your perception and doesn't, you don't,
Because
you have
he's
to
too
remind
short.
your, because he's too short, and you have to remind yourself that you remember him. Um, and
Well, as a
yeah,
short king, I am very
it's a
offended
short
by
king,
this.
exactly.
Yeah.
But he's not even a short king is like the sad part. He's just
Mm.
like a he's a fucking just like short bubble of earth
Yes, yeah.
as they
Well,
say. It opens up with this, the book opens up with this quote where from some bitch, Flora Thompson, from this book called Lark Rise,
mm,
that I think is really beautiful. And the book Lark Rise is about this young girl growing up outside of Oxford. Um, and it's a bunch of children running around, and at the end of it, they're screaming, "We are bubbles of earth, bubbles of earth, bubbles of earth," um, which kind of sets up the novel.
mm.
But yeah, I've always thought that was a really interesting kind of image, is like people being bubbles of earth. I don't know. Um,
Kind of like, yeah. I like that as well. Like
like,
he's got so many turns of phrases like that are just, of some which he gets from other people, but others which I love how he does. I love when a writer gets really Shakespeare and like invents words. Like, what is that word that he invents to describe the theosophical idea? It's sort of like
oh,
um
when he
in
says it's when he says
interfabula.
it's infub, yeah, exactly. Did he make that word? I was actually gonna Google
He,
that.
yeah, he made it up. Like that's a
What I
word that
was
he
gonna say
invented.
is that it reminds me of Cupcake, who said that she wanted to blow bubbles and sperm. Um,
My name Cupcake. Yeah. No, it's infundibula.
Infundibular, yeah,
Yeah, so the
yeah.
idea, which is very crucial to the book. So, like Edgewood as well is described. You get a little bit of a description of it in this first book, but it's sort of described in more detail in like the interiors and stuff like that in the later books, which we will talk about. But like it's described as this like architectural marvel that is like many houses in one. Like, so it looks like weird. But the idea of the infundibula word is this idea of like uh the fairy, like it's not necessarily the fairy world. I guess it is like a way to try to scientifically account for it, but the idea that you move into the fairy world and it seems small to us, but the further you go in, the bigger it gets. Like it's this
They
interesting
just, yeah, the
quantum.
concentric circles,
Yes, yeah. It's almost
kind of. They like
quantum
just,
physics kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah. He like describes it as like this in this flashback. Um, the patriarch, the kind of like ancient early 20th century patriarch, is presenting his ideas based on some Roman writer. I forget his name, but
Uh,
I've seen
Para
him.
Paraclesius or something like
Yeah,
that. He's not actually Roman.
Periclesius.
He's a Renaissance writer,
Oh,
actually.
Renaissance.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Um,
like a
presenting
hermetic
his
guy.
ideas to the Theosophical Society, and he describes reality as a series of concentric circles, and human beings as sort of standing on the outskirts of that entire kind of like geometry. And he says that the further in each concentric circle that you go into gets larger and larger, despite being kind of embedded in like an outside circle. And like the sense that you get during this flashback is that all of these theosophical, kind of like uppity, dusty theosophical people are kind of sort of confused and don't know what to really make of it. And he eventually builds a house for this mysterious little British nymphette. Uh, and what's her name? Violet? Yeah, Violet
Yeah, Violet.
Bramble.
Yeah.
Who's been kind of like fairy touched. She's been like touched by the Fae almost. And seems to kind of like have some kind of power that is a little bit indescribable to the people around her. But and she seems to resent it almost. She doesn't completely she doesn't deny the fact of her power, but she seems to understand that the people around her don't fully understand like uh what her experience means, and like what her sort of, I don't know, what this like connection to this other realm, what the significance of it is. And she's also described as being fairly inarticulate,
Mm.
so she just doesn't really have a good way to, you know, describe what her connection to fairy is, but she's very kind of otherworldly and almost feral, you know, and it
Mm.
describes the motif of like the unibrow. Do you have a
Mm.
unibrow?
Yes.
I have a unibrow as well.
Yeah. That's
And
where
after reading this,
we're magical fae boys.
yeah, we're magical little fae boys. Everyone in the book who has a unibrow, if a character has a unibrow in this book, it means that they are like they have some kind of like ancestral connection to the world of fairy or fae or whatever. It's not even the world of fairy is the thing. Like he's one of the magical things about this book is how elusive Crowley is in like defining what the world actually is.
Hmm.
And to be honest, one of the hard sells about this book is the fact that it deals with quote unquote fairies, you know, but like they're like only like they're like fairies in quotations almost.
Yeah.
Um
I don't think the word fairy is even mentioned until
yeah.
something like 300 pages in or something like that. But you know,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
if you're in the know, you get the references because I think early on in the first book that we're discussing, when we're talking about fuck, I always get the characters mixed up. It is Oberon, I think, the elder
Yeah.
Oberon, who's trying to take photos of fairies in the bottom of the garden, which was like,
Yeah.
for people who don't know, that was like a big thing in England at the time, you know, like taking pictures of like
Yeah.
children finding fairies in the bottom of the garden and like using, often these photos obviously were faked, and they were like suggesting something, but it was a real, I wouldn't say it extended to like tulip mania sort of thing, but it was a real trend that sort of
Yeah.
people kind of like sort of did. But so it's referencing that. And I don't think it ever in that section even mentions fairies, but like if you know that
Yeah.
reference, you get it, you know. Um that's
I think they were called like sorry, go on.
go.
They were called like the Collington or the I don't know what they're called. Like the I'm gonna search up fairy photography
Photography.
hosts. But I know that I've looked into them before. The Cottingley fairies.
Oh yeah.
Um and which was basically these two dumb bitches. These
There's
these
always
two
two,
really
isn't
dumb
there? There's always at least
bitches.
two
Yeah,
dumb bitches.
this is some
Red
like
Scare.
red fuck, what's the name of that movie about the two girls who murder their mom?
Oh,
Um
Heavenly Creatures.
Heavenly Creatures. Yeah,
Yeah.
these two Heavenly Creatures hoes came out with all these photographs that seem to document them interacting with fairies. Um some member of the Theosophical Society caught wind of this, and eventually Arthur Conan Doyle found out about these photos. Arthur Conan Doyle, most people would know him as the writer of the Sherlock Holmes series, which is famous for, you know, kind of introducing deductive reasoning
Hmm.
to the public, which is like the big kind of irony here. But Arthur Conan Doyle ended up being really invested in these photographs and thinking of them as actually scientific evidence for the existence of fairies. And later, these girls, like much later in life, they admitted, one of the sisters came out and said all of the photographs were just flat out frauds, and one of the other sisters said that most of them were frauds except for one of them. But here's the thing, though: both sisters claimed that they actually interacted with fairies. And I have looked at these. I'm gonna see if they. Yeah, there's this one photo. Yeah, here it is. So there's this one photo where it's like three kind of fairy like kind of shapes in this kind of grassy little knot. And this is the photo that one of the sisters says is totally legitimate.
Mm.
Um, and it is a very weird photograph because the rest of the photographs, once the sisters said what their technique was, which is basically they like cut out pictures from magazines or like traced them or whatever, and then like kind of like held them up. Um, you can tell what they are once they've like kind of like revealed what their technique was. But this last photograph is really hard to explain, and it's the photograph that the one sister says is completely legitimate. And I know that like photography experts have said that like it was probably a double exposure or something, but it doesn't look like a double exposure to me.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know. Again, these are just two bitches who are full of shit, so I don't know what to even think. Um,
But one of the things that like I think is really interesting about this novel and this part in particular, like that part where like he's talking about the photographs and trying to like in that sort of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle way, trying to like get scientific evidence for, you know, the Fey realm or whatever, and approaching it in this really kind of like um mechanistic scientist way is something that I think is really interesting about what the novel is doing as well, because the novel is very, and we'll get into this when we talk as the narrative goes on, but the novel is very psychologically realistic, like in
yeah,
terms of, you know, this is some of
it's almost
this,
mumblecore.
yeah, yes, yeah. But there's also these elements of the fantastic, and it's like he kind of collides a kind of logical, positivistic world with a, you know, the world of architecture and measurements and photography and, you know, with and modernity really with like these fantastic elements. And it's almost like those elements are he's not doing a thing that other writers have done before, which we can talk about in the Patreon episode, which will be interesting to talk about. But uh, it's almost like they're oil and water, and it kind of mirrors the way into the book as well. If you go into this book with this kind of nerdish science fiction fantasy kind of way of reading it, like, you know, like I've said this
Yeah,
many times, but like, you know, if you go into it being like, oh, what's the magic system? Like you're going
yeah,
to be disappointed, like,
yeah,
because it's not that kind of book. It's not like that rationalist kind of book.
yeah,
And he's arguing. I don't think that he's arguing anything, but like it does suggest that that is the wrong way to read a book. that that it's
yeah.
not. You can't get magic. You can't approach magic, whether that's literary magic or, you know, the Fae or whatever, from this like rationalistic lens. So I think it's sort of gesturing towards that.
Yeah, no, I definitely got that from that section where Oberon, basically Daily Alice and Smokey Barnable have just been married, and they're kind of taking this honeymoon through the Edgewater like
The
campus,
woods.
like
Yeah.
the woods, the the woods that the Edgewater is on the edge of,
Mm.
um, or sorry,
And she's
Edgewood.
naked a lot, which is
Yeah,
fun.
she's naked a lot, which I
Mm.
want to talk about. I want to talk about this like sex in this book, but
Mm.
we'll get to that. But yeah, Oberon has been influenced by, he's kind of a non-believer in this weird way, but also like a believer. Like
Mm.
he believes in the world, but he is sort of like eternally kind of befuddled. And at this point in the story, he's like an old man, and he's trying to take these pictures, and he's been influenced by the descent of man. He like went to
Mm.
the university, and he was introduced to Charles Darwin,
I
and
love his Darwinistic
he
like
like lived
theory
on
on
it.
the ferry. That was the best. Like
Yeah.
the like
Oh yeah,
what if
how
a branch of humanity branched off?
yeah.
Like
He thinks that like a he understands Charles Darwin's theories that kind of like there is the survival of the fittest kind of fight, and that humanity eventually progressed through it. But he also suggests that what if there was a branch of earthly life that didn't evolve into material reality, but actually evolved into into those kind of like concentric circles that are,
hmm.
they evolved in a kind of almost into like a psychic realm or something. um and this is interesting. This is very interesting to me. I do know some about theosophy. I was part of, and honestly still consider myself to be part of, a Catholic Gnostic church in Los Angeles. um
Sounds
and
heretical, John.
I know. Be quiet. Um, I've heard that word too much lately. Um, yeah, I don't really want to get into that, but my 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 bishop, Stephen Heller, who has a Wikipedia page, you can look him up. He he's talked about theosophy before, and has actually um he's spoken about the evolutionary aspect of theosophy as essentially being its biggest weakness, which is interesting to me because I think that that's also like this first section of Little Big makes a lot of jokes about theosophy. Like
hmm
theosophy was a very silly movement in a
hmm
lot of ways.
Do you want to?
And
Can you? I know a little bit about it, but can you sort of just give us a potted what
yeah,
theosophy is for
it
listeners?
so it was a kind of a pre-New Age movement. A lot of people kind of think of it as the progenitor of the New Age movement. And it was started basically in earnest by a lady named Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky. That was
Madame
my favorite.
Blavatsky. Yeah,
Yeah, Madame Blavatsky, who wrote two kind of
sounds like a
uh
Tintin character, by the way. Madame
yeah,
Blavatsky.
exactly. Like a Rush, like a Spielberg Indiana Jones,
Yeah.
like Russian villain. And Blavatsky wrote two large famous books. One of them is called Isis Unveiled, and the other one is called, oh, it's on my shelf over here. I'm sorry, that's revealing how much of a fucking nerd I am. I'm like blanking on the name of the other book. It doesn't even fucking matter. But she was this eccentric Russian woman who was trying to kind of marry Western and Eastern uh kind of like theological systems together. And she she it's theosophy, it's somewhat related to spiritualism. But Blavatsky herself rejected spiritualism very famously. She didn't think spiritualism, she just thought it was a big hoax,
Mm,
basically. Um and it's kind of a really difficult movement to sum up. It was mostly based in America, and there were a bunch of different kind of prophets who sort of sprung up in the creation of theosophy. And um one of them, which I have a suspicion that John Crowley might have based Violet Bramble off of was this guy named Krishnamurti, I think was his name.
Hmm.
Um, and Krishnamurti was this uh, basically a bunch of the Theosophists went to India, and one of them was this guy named C.W. Leadbeater, and who was famously somewhat pedophilic. And he saw this like beautiful Indian boy who he said like radiated just like purity and sinlessness. And he decided that this little boy would be like kind of a messiah almost. Lucky for the Theosophists, this young boy ended up being very, very brilliant and spiritually intuitive. Um, there are stories that I've heard of certain spiritual things happening around this kid that I think have some water. Like I think they have like I don't think they're completely bullshit. And I think that the most interesting thing about this Krishnamurti guy is the fact that he eventually uh he there this whole cult they tried to like they kind of the theosophical movement tried to turn him into this thing, and they
Like a
based this entire
messiah sort of thing.
a messiah, and they
Mm.
based this entire cult around him. And he actually eventually backed out and was like, this is not what I'm not looking for followers. He disbanded the cult that was based around him, and he basically just said that his only mission in life was to kind of spiritually liberate people into following their own path, and that like as long as you followed someone or like thought of someone else as a spiritual leader, you were basically lost. And so Blavatsky, I'm pretty sure, had died by the time that all had happened. And I've gone on such a big tangent.
No, we love
But
tangents on this show. It's fine.
yeah.
So,
Um,
but in terms of the beliefs, it's just sort of like a syncretic kind of trying to
yeah,
merge
exactly.
the.
It's merging Eastern and Western thought. It's very kind of it's very just charitable. It's Gnostic in the sense that it's concerned about the source of sort of spiritual reception, I
Mhm.
guess. And is trying to come up with a system that, or not even a system, but just like a way of thinking that sort of combines all of these disparate cultural and historical religions. But
And
a
it's
lot of
also
silliness came out
is
of it. Like it
it's
was kind of a big silly hat. And yeah, what were you gonna say?
oh yeah, I've just noticed that it's a catnip for a lot of suits on the
Yeah.
internet, um,
Yes.
including
It's very a
one that
lot of
I've
like
sorry, go.
yeah, go yeah, a lot of like the art that came out of Theosophy is almost feels like a little Bronze Age perverty. To be honest, like, whatever. But yeah, they were wearing it was kind of a cosplay. And I I think John Crowley in this first section is trying to take what drew all of these theosophists in the first place and sort of trying to like liberate it a little bit from that movement.
Mm,
And like kind of ask, because in other ways I do think that theosophy is a really, really, at least historically interesting example of like an indigenous American religion,
mm,
which I think there are very few of. The only one that I can think of is Mormonism, and then maybe some of the, obviously like the Native American whatever religions.
mhm.
But
Well,
yeah, what were you going to say?
I
Remind me.
think, I think, um, I think Protestantism gets its perfected form in the US. So
Oh,
in some ways, like even though it didn't begin in America, it did like it got its, final freezer form in America. Um,
yeah.
but I was gonna say, like, speaking of America, like this is a really good example of an American fantasy. Like it's not importing because the world of the Fae or like magic or fantasy and stuff like that is often it's an old world thing, right? Like
Yeah.
people in Ireland and all that stuff about continental Europe as well. Like that was a whole mythology, a folk mythology, and folk mythology exists in the US, obviously, but like what it's doing is it's like importing some of that stuff into the new world in a really interesting way because the gateway to the quote unquote Fey world in this book is what would have been considered at the time a very modern house or a very modern idea of like this discombobulated like smashing together of all of these architectural styles, and that is like the part, that is the gateway to the realm we're talking about here. um so like it's the kind of new and the old kind of coming together rather than just like I don't know, overlaying like a patina of modernity over the old or something like that, giving it a new spit and
Yeah.
polish or like
And like the house, yeah, the house that the book takes place in, Edgewood, is kind of the centerpiece of all of it.
mm,
And was created by, in the story of this book, was created by John Drinkwater, was that his
mhm,
name?
mhm,
um and is a sample house, as they call it. He's this
mm,
brilliant architect. It's almost like Randian character in a
mhm,
way. Um, he's like this brilliant builder and designer of you know like high-rise buildings, these like huge like gargoyled sort of New York monuments. But his masterpiece is really this house in the
mhm,
wilderness called Edgewood, and each side of the house is a different style, and it was built as a quote unquote sample house so that people would come and say, I want this style of house, or I want this style of house. Um, and it's a very touching moment because Violet is this scared little girl who's been told by Mrs. Underhill, this strange kind of like specter that appears in the first section, that she will live in many houses. And when she
mm.
finds out that this man, this old pervert, has built this house of many different styles, she realizes that that's what Mrs. Underhill was sort of saying. Um, so yeah, so the rest of the book will take place in this, or not even the rest of the book, sorry, like a heavy portion of the book will take place in this house called Edgewood, which is kind of this like kaleidoscopic architectural marvel that nobody has even really seen at this point.
Mm, mm. And yeah, sort of folds in on itself as well. The one thing I wanted to mention as well about the book in itself is the interesting way the chapters are arranged. It's very like old style, like almost, I can't even remember if this book did this, but it just reminds me of Wind in the Willows. Like, I don't know,
Oh,
I just made that association. Like, so you have these like big 20-page chapters, but then it sort of separates them with like these little glosses, with like kind of scene markers that just tell you
yeah.
what's going to happen in the little section. And it actually makes for, it clips along because of that, because it's sort of separated by those little kind of almost vignettes, uh, like little vignettes make up. And like the attention to structure is another like architectural motif that I think he builds into the writing of the book itself, which is really cute. Um, but uh, yeah, what you mentioned, I think before we started recording, um, the magical realism stuff. Like, what's your issue with magical realism versus viewing this as magical realism?
I think just it's, well, first of all, first and foremost, it's not in the tradition of magical
Yeah,
realism.
yeah.
Like
Oh, you
people,
mentioned that before, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's written in the tradition of just like, honestly, just like the British novel, basically,
Yeah.
like the British or American novel. And
J.M.
st
Barrie, Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll,
Yeah,
sort of. Yeah.
exactly. It's way more comparable to kind of like psychedelic experiments in style along
Mm,
those lines, rather than, again, like a you know a South American sort of thing where people turn into clouds all of a sudden, or it feels like it doesn't. This isn't like Salvador Dali, you know, like
No.
it doesn't feel like it's um yeah, I'm trying to like isolate kind of like why I think
It's
it's different.
Well, because it's not like that, but it's also like not full on fantasy either. Like the
Yeah.
fantasy elements of it are sort of, and this is why I like it. Like I think I said before, like diaphanous, like they're just sort of like, you know,
Yeah.
it's the misty in between like the real
Yeah.
world and the Fey world. That's where like most of the magic of the book kind of exists. So almost in this uh kind of Schrodinger's cat sort of, does it exist or does it not sort of kind of way. Like, but those sorts of ideas where like you get lots of nerdish critiques that are like, well, give me the rules of the world and all that sort of
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
It's like, no.
What fucking nerds.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So like why do you need that? Just enjoy the experience that he's giving you. Like
Yeah.
it's not
It's
about yeah, sorry.
it's not like a magical system, and to be honest, the only magic quote unquote system that I've ever read in a fantasy novel that I thought completely worked front to back was um the Malazan Empire books.
Oh yeah.
Um which, have you heard of those?
I think I read the first one like years ago, like in the early
Yeah, it's
2000s.
those ones. The magic system in that one is amazing and actually says something. Like it has literary value, but these fucking nerds who are obsessed with like they want a fucking magic system. Are you kidding me? Like I have to say though, I don't think that it's not nonsense. Like
No,
what
no,
he's
no,
talking,
not at all.
it's not just like random, just like random twee nonsense. Like
Mm.
I think that the best introduction to kind of the quote unquote magic of this book is the scene where Daily Alice walks backwards into a rainbow.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and which was the moment in this book where I realized that I was reading like a masterpiece that I would, like that hadn't existed before, a kind of book that was like truly, truly unique. Basically, Daily Alice relates a story of finding she's walking through Edgewood one day, through like the grounds surrounding it, and she sees this rainbow, and she kind of is like, I want to be inside of that rainbow. And what she realizes is that the closer she gets to it, the further the rainbow sort of recedes from her. And then her dog, Spark or whatever, supposedly relates to her that you can't walk into a rainbow, you have to actually walk away from it. And
Mm.
if you walk away from the rainbow, you'll actually enter the rainbow. Um, and I do have a good metaphor for this, which is that, like, if you're looking at the night sky and you see, like, a lot of times if you see a star in the corner of your eye, it'll seem really bright. And then when you look at it head on, it disappears.
Mm.
And the night sky is kind of brighter from the corner of your eye.
Mm.
And so it's talking about like the world of magic that it's talking about is this kind of dream realm where your mind is kind of liberated.
Mm.
And like that, a lot of people see that dream realm and sort of have a sense of connection to it. But when they see that world, they walk straight towards it, just like
Mm.
Daily Alice does. And
Mm.
they don't have the dog next to them who tells them to walk away from the rainbow. And so it's almost like a kind of phenomenological, I'd say, like it's not a system of magic that's based on like
Rules.
hocus pocus,
Yeah, yeah.
or even, yeah, it's not like wands, it's not like Harry Potter where people are like throwing spells at each other. It's like a
Ontological.
yeah, it's
Mm.
and we can get more into this later in the series with the art of memory, where I
Mm.
think that he really solidifies what the quote unquote magic is, which
Mm.
like I feel like the word magic will scare a lot of people away,
Mm.
but because it sounds kind of pagan almost, but um it's not like it's I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to elaborate and figure out what human consciousness is.
Mm.
And I think that John Crowley is amazed at the mystery of human consciousness, and the point of Little Big is to bring you into closer contact with what human consciousness even like what it even means,
Mm.
like
Mm.
what kind of what even having this like aware mind, sort of even like what the potential there is.
Yeah, and like
Like
builds that into like and it's the magic of consciousness, but
right,
like
yeah.
or unconsciousness as well, because like I think Crowley is a good Freudian in the sense that like I like that you mentioned before, like the sort of dream logic to that
Mm.
scene in particular. Um I'm of the belief that look, when people say dream logic, they usually mean nonsense, but I don't think
Mm.
dreams are nonsense. Like I think dreams are very striking for their meaning. And like part of being a human being who dreams is like pursuing apprehending the meaning of what that is. Like because they're not nonsense. Like they
Yeah.
might be cryptic, they might be mysterious, but there's something to them. Like and so yeah, I think like he believes in that kind of dreamlike, you know, there's a knowledge there that to be kind of pursued or experienced. Whereas
Right.
a lot of people when they say logic, they just mean woo, psychedelic
Yeah.
imagery, kaleidoscopic, like yeah, weird
Yeah.
shit happening. Like, and this is the
Yeah.
thing with that annoys me about a lot of contemporary shit. I think Jack's talked about this as well, like where people can't work out how to fucking end things, so they just like, ooh, dream logic, random magical realism thing
Did they
happens, you
do
know?
that with that new show with Nathan For You?
Yeah, the curse.
I
Yeah, they did
Did
that.
you watch
Yeah.
that?
No, I haven't
Okay,
watched it
what?
yet.
Oh, you haven't? Okay.
No.
But I heard that there was some kind of shitty ending.
Yeah, they did that. Yeah, they did that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah. So it's like I feel like that is not this book. Like this book isn't like here's a random realistic situation and we're just going to pile in the random magic crap. Like it's not like
Yeah.
that at all. So
Yeah.
just so we're clear.
It's well, yeah, and that goes into kind of like what the hardest part about this book is, which is that the first section of this book gives you an impression that the rest of this is going to be kind of this like bucolic,
Hmm.
twee, kind of like I don't know, like magical piggly wiggly sort of
Yeah.
thing. Just for listeners who are following along, Little Big evolves into an apocalyptic prophecy about America
Mhm.
that and if you're on right-wing Twitter, I will say that this book has a lot of nice nuggets about libtards in it. So you're gonna want to stick around. But I don't want to say too much, but it doesn't this book has kind of like it makes you I think it's a joy to read. I think it's absolutely great, but having given this book to people and they only read the first or maybe the second section of it, like you don't get the full scope of this.
Oh yeah.
This like multi-generational apocalyptic American epic. Um, and the only like I'd say that the book a book that it really reminds me of is actually To the Lighthouse,
Yes. Oh, that's a real
which
I've
I
never thought about that. That's true. Yeah.
which I think it's superior to the Lighthouse.
Mm.
But it has that I don't want to get too much into it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think you know what we should probably like return
Well, yeah,
to in a
well,
later.
I'll make a note of that, and we'll return to that
Yeah.
in the relevant section. Um,
Yeah. Wait, so did you have a show and tell piece?
yeah, but we'll do that for the
Okay.
Patreon. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Oh, got it. Okay.
before we do that, I you mentioned the horniness. Let's talk about the horniness,
Oh
and
yeah.
then we'll move on to the Patreon episode.
Okay. So
Well, I'll just say that sometimes this is very low hanging fruit of me, but like I always do this with what I know is going to be a divisive book, is that I'll go on Goodreads, I'll go on blogs, and I'll go and like look at other people's responses, and I just find the most retarded ones and then just like report back. And one of these I found like, oh my God, it was so funny. It was like a review from like a YouTube channel, and it was like a patron review. So like this guy's, or I think
So did
he's a
you pay for this review?
no, 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 no. This guy's
Okay, got it.
obviously been paid by his patrons to do
Oh,
this
I
review,
see.
so
Okay.
he's been
Yeah.
forced to read Little Big. And like this guy was like, he might have been a they them, I'm not sure, but he runs a channel called like The Geek Show, one of those like fucking insufferable nerd like YouTube channels where like they just consume whatever, Disney fantastic science fiction slop and then just like talk about
Yeah.
it and how great it is. Um, but he's like he's wearing like fluoro pink glasses,
Oh
a
no.
golf hat, has like a
I'm
emerald
gonna
neck.
see. What's his name?
I'll try and find it again, but like I'll send it to you. But yeah,
Okay.
and he's like one of the things that he complained about. He referenced things in later parts of the book that I won't get into because we want to make this sort of like a bit of a spoiler-free experience as so people can read along with us. But he talked about the male gaze in this book. It's like, guys, it was written in 1981, so obviously it's going to be a little bit more sexist. And like, so he's going on and on about like how there's a lot of women naked, like there's a lot of sex, there's a lot of like men looking at women, and I'm like, yeah, and like, but also it actually brought up a really good point to me, which is that um why talk about this? Like, I think
Yeah.
people think that identifying a trope is like criticism,
Yeah.
like it's just like John Crowley looked at like his book represented a naked woman. This is male gaze. It's just like, and like, are you what?
Retards. They're
Like,
just retards.
yeah, yeah, but like,
Wait, okay.
are you going to do
Um,
anything with that, or are you just going to identify trope, move on? Like, yeah. Anyway,
here, wait, can I, sorry, I have this message on my Zoom that
Hmm.
says your browser is preventing access to your microphone.
No, I can
Um,
hear you. It's fine.
you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Hmm.
So it's recording on your side.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what the podcast recording thing is like, but
Uh-huh.
I just
Well, it
wanted to
should
make
be.
sure.
If I can hear you,
Okay.
it's recording. I'm guessing,
Okay.
but yeah.
Um, yeah, this book is really horny. To get back on track. So I was I for the past like 2 months, I've been watching Gundam Mobile, which begins with Mobile Suit Gundam.
I
This
got into
relates.
I got into
Okay.
that. Like I started watching it from the beginning, and I was just because I decided for winter I wanted like a really big
Wait,
like
when did you start watching?
like last year. I need to get back into it,
Okay.
but I've
Okay.
watched the first season of the original, which was
Okay.
like, oh my
Same.
God.
Amuro.
Amaro, Amaro.
Amuro.
Mm,
Um, Gundam has totally rocked my world. A lot of this has to do with Zachary Chichi, who, in various conversations, has compelled me to watch Gundam from the beginning. And I've seen at this point the original Mobile Suit Gundam and Mobile Suit Gundam, or sorry, Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam. Which have you seen Zeta yet?
no, I haven't.
It's if you've watched Mobile Suit Gundam, get on Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam because the animation quality like is
Takes a step up.
exponentially better. First
Yeah.
of all, the writing is more complex. I have to say the story of Mobile Suit Gundam is I do prefer slightly over Zeta. Um, I think that there's like a purity there that I really like. But okay, the reason I bring up Gundam is because I just read this interview that Zach Langley Chi sent to me from what's his name? Toshino? The director of Gundam, where he talks about how when he's creating characters, he thinks explicitly about their genitals and what their genitals are like. And it explains a lot.
So true.
Okay? It explains a lot because when you're watching Gundam, you're like, why? You're like, okay, these are a bunch of cartoons. Even if you're not an otaku, I think if you watch these shows, you'll be like, this is horny. Like, this is not just a cartoon. Like, these are sexual creatures. And so he talks about how there is like in relating his characters to each other, he thinks explicitly about how their genitals interact and like what their sexual proclivities are specifically. And with like the Little Big World, when you start to read it, it feels almost cartoonish, right? Like it feels almost like you're reading a Miyazaki movie or something. And it's almost shocking when the book, in a very like unabashed, unembarrassed way, like just like jumps into these like sex scenes between like Daily Alice and Smokey that I actually find really sexy. Like when Smokey shows up to the Drinkwater house to Edgewood, he says he needs to take a shower because he's covered in sweat, and Daily Alice says, "I'll give you a tongue bath," and is literally what she says. And then there's like this psychedelic sex scene that occurs after they're married underneath this gazebo where Daily Alice like becomes like it's very like first of all, it's very like, it reminds me, I'm reading The Fairy Queen right now. It's
the major inspiration for this too, yeah.
Right. There's like this very voyeuristic, as like Palia has talked about. I kind of wish I hadn't read Palia before I'd read it, because it feels like I'm just like it, like as I'm reading it, I'm like kind of confirming everything she said. But she's right. There's a very voyeuristic aspect to The Fairy Queen, and all of that is in Little Big. Like it's very just like, even though it's not like the sex isn't explicit, it's just like Mobile Suit Gundam, where all of the characters have genitals, this isn't, and like, I think that this is one of the weaknesses in American literature, or in like the history of American literature in general, like especially in like the fabulist kind of genre, like even in like Mark Twain, I'd say. I mean, I love Mark Twain, but his characters don't seem to have genitals, like there really is a kind of sexless, I don't even want to say sexlessness, but like there's an innocence there that isn't broken.
Yes.
And like Little Big, I'd say that in some ways it does keep the innocence, but the sex is like, when the sex pops up, it's almost embarrassing to read, because at first you think you're reading this book that's been like written by a genius child, and then like they just start like, I don't know, they just start doing it, and
rutting in the woods.
It's just like hot. Like it's just, it's hot.
Well, I could point out a very prurient thing here, which I wouldn't put John Crowley past this actually, but the title itself is suggestive of an erection.
Oh yeah. That's true.
It was little, now it's big. It's funny you mentioned the thing about like the innocence and the sexlessness in American literature, because I saw on Twitter, like just this morning actually, someone posted this kind of fragment of I think it's a diary or a letter or something from Herman Melville, who I think his books are very sexual. Like, so he's not in that tradition that you were talking about.
I think this Moby Dick is like one of the sexiest books I've ever read. Actually.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much, and very homoerotic too. Like, Billy Butt. Yeah. But it was this quote that he was talking about Hawthorne, because he really loved Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it felt, the way it read was just like, there was so much innuendo in it. I'll read it to you. But already I feel that this hawthorn has dropped germinous seeds into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him, and further shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil of my southern soul. It reads like a bodice ripper. But you know what I mean?
Nathaniel
Like,
Hawthorne.
yes.
Okay. Oh, and Queen. I haven't read The Scarlet Letter, but I've read um what's it called? House of Seven Gables?
Oh yeah,
Is
I
that
haven't
what it's
read that
called?
one.
House
Yeah,
of
I've read Scarlet Letter, but not the other one.
um I'm trying to think back to that book. Like it's very constrained, I'd say. Yeah, it's
Mm.
wait, so Herman Melville wrote that?
Yeah, yeah. He was just
Okay.
talking about his love of Hawthorne, but like he did it in
Okay.
his like explicitly like maybe not explicitly, but maybe it's explicit to like modern readers, very sexual to
Well, I mean
his
that's just
his
like
New
Gundam
England
though.
seed.
Because Gundam is like a children's cartoon that children are supposed to be watching,
Yeah.
but for some reason, if you're like you're just watching this and you're like hard the entire time, like you're like horny, you're like
You could just be into robots, John. That could be
I could just be into, or I could just be into like anime characters. That
Oh, he's one
possibility.
of those. So we
Yeah,
we have to end this series right now.
I know, which is
Um,
even more embarrassing than being into robots.
Um, all right. Anything more to say on this? This is sort of an introductory episode. So, like, we'll have more to say in each part that we'll do
Yeah.
every month. But yeah, any final thoughts on this section in particular? Or just
Um,
advice for reading this book?
I my advice for reading this book is just fucking enjoy it, you bitch. Like,
Yes.
um,
Submit.
submit. I mean, like, it's not even like mo. I don't understand people who have a hard time getting through this book because the first time that I read it, it was the most like joyful experience that I've ever had reading in my entire life. Like completely singular and has not been
Uh,
replicated by any other book.
oh yeah, and these reviewers
Um,
saying it's hard to read. Like it's super
I don't.
readable. Like
It's
it's not
very
even
readable.
I'm
It's
not
not
even doing
difficult.
yeah, I'm not even doing like a sued I can read anything sort of thing. It's a very readable book. Like
Yeah, it's like almost like I would describe the style as being almost experimentally readable. Like
hmm
there are literally sentences in this book where he will describe something as like he'll be like the big house or something. Like like he does stuff like that where it's like um yeah, there's nothing difficult about this book, and if you're skeptical about starting it, especially after the first two sections, and you think that like it's just gonna be this thing that happens in the woods,
hmm
this like little magic wood fairy thing, you don't know what you're talking about, and you have to finish the goddamn book,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Like you have to see the you have to see the beautiful prophecy that has quite frankly already happened.
hmm
Uh and yeah, it's just bitch read.
Yeah, bitch, read it. So what we're gonna do now, so like with every episode that we will do, we will be doing a companion episode on the Patreon show. So go to patreon.com/getting lit. And with each section, we're gonna bring a surprise sort of show and tell item that the section that we've just read has reminded us both of. So I don't know what John has chosen, and he doesn't know what I have chosen, and we're just sort of going to riff on that in the Patreon episode. So sign up for that if you want to hear that as well. But yeah, please join us. Get this book. The next episode will be released in a month's time, so you've got plenty of time to read this first section and then the second section as well, and kind of read along with us every month. Every section is like 90 to 100 pages, so it's not a big
Yeah.
commitment in a month. So do a few pages each night.
So don't
Um,
be a little bitch,
yeah,
okay?
yeah,
Don't be a little fucking cuck, okay?
yeah,
Read this book with us about fairies.
yeah.
Um,
Read along with the fairy unibrow boys about
yeah.
fairies, okay? All right. All right. Thanks so much, John. Do you have any links or anything to shill or whatever that
No, I have
no.
nothing to show.
Just this.
Just this, just a little big, just John Crowley, just rubbing John
Okay.
Crowley's like dick, right
Genitals.
his genitals.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. I'll see you. I'll see you on the Patreon and then for the free episode next month.